Okay, settle in, because today's real story is not just a story. It's a chilling descent into the depths of human depravity, a heartbreaking tale of innocence lost, and a relentless pursuit of justice that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. This is a story that unfolds not in some far-off fictional land, but in the ordinary, unsuspecting corners of West Virginia. A place where small-town tranquility often conceals the most sinister secrets. This is the harrowing story of Riley Crossman. Our narrative begins not with a scream, but with a gentle, almost lyrical introduction of life itself. December 22nd, 2003, in the unassuming town of Martinsburg, West Virginia. Here, Riley was born, a tiny spark of life in a city of roughly 20,000 souls. Martinsburg, a place characterized by its low cost of living, minimal crime rates, and a pervasive small-town charm, seemed the idyllic setting for raising a family, a postcard-perfect scene that would soon be shattered by the cruel hand of fate. Riley's early years were a testament to the simple joys of childhood. She was a loving, cheerful child, her days filled with shared laughter with her younger sister Jade and the close bonds she developed with her older brothers, Ryder and Riker. Her childhood was seemingly one that would lead to a happy and promising future. Her journey, though typically uneventful, took a significant turn with a seismic shift in her family structure. The divorce of her parents, a traumatic event for any child, deeply impacted Riley and her siblings. While they continued to visit their father in Martinsburg regularly, their day-to-day lives were now centered around their mother, Chantel, in Berkeley Springs, a town approximately 25 miles away. This geographical separation, a seemingly insignificant detail, would later become a cruel irony, a symbol of the fractured family dynamic that would ultimately play a significant, albeit tragic, role in the events that would unfold. Then, into this already complicated family dynamic, stepped Andy McCauley. Andy, Chantel's new boyfriend, would eventually move in with them, creating a facade of a blended family, a seemingly loving and stable unit that hid a deadly secret simmering beneath the surface. Those who knew Riley described her as a radiant soul, a tapestry woven with threads of care, reliability, creativity, and a touch of stubbornness, a characteristic those who know teenagers can attest to. Yet, beneath the surface, beneath the teenage persona she wore, she possessed an innocence and naivety unusual for girls her age, a vulnerability that would eventually become her tragic undoing. Riley didn't live a life in isolation. She thrived in social settings. She was a vibrant social butterfly. Her life was full of friends and activities. She was an active member of her community. She also excelled in her studies, a diligent student with a bright academic future. Her teachers all commented on her work ethic and willingness to help others. She had a bright future ahead of her. By 2018, Riley seemed to have achieved an almost perfect harmony. She was a happy young woman, brimming with potential, a star on the rise. Then, as it often does in the whirlwind of teenage life, love came knocking. She met Hayden Lacey, and the connection was instantaneous. Their relationship was a textbook teenage romance, a whirlwind of shared moments and the quiet promises of forever. They met each other's parents, danced at school events, and spent countless hours in the digital realm of texts and FaceTime calls. They seemed the perfect match, a beacon of youthful romance, their love a shining example of hope. Now let's shift our focus to Tuesday, May 7th, 2019. The sun rose over Berkeley Springs, an unremarkable beginning to what would become an unforgettable day. Riley attended school, her day mirroring the typical routine of a teenager. She returned home around 3 p.m., where she found her mother, Chantel, asleep on the sofa, exhausted from working 2 jobs, something Riley was keenly aware of. Riley, being the considerate young woman she was, tried not to disturb her, but eventually woke her so she'd be on time for her shift that night. After Chantel left for work, Riley spent the evening with her brothers, her grandmother Debbie, and the ever-present Andy McCauley. It was a seemingly ordinary evening, nothing out of the ordinary, the rhythm of daily life playing out in its regular fashion. Then the mood changes, subtly at first, then dramatically. Around 7:30 p.m. after her grandmother left for the evening, Riley retreated to her bedroom, her cell phone in hand, preparing for a FaceTime call with Hayden, something she frequently did. But their conversation took an unexpected, almost jarring turn. An argument erupted between them, fueled by Riley's growing anxieties about Hayden's impending school trip to Washington, D.C. The gnawing fear that Hayden might be attracted to another girl ate at her from the inside. Hayden, weary and exhausted from the argument, fell asleep around 10 p.m. But Riley, her mind racing and filled with dread, sent Hayden a chilling message at 11:01 p.m. "Andy's in my room. Shoo! Don't say anything about it so he can hear everything." Then, 12 minutes later, a second, more disturbing message, filled with raw, unfiltered fear. "I'm scared, babe." These 2 messages are like a sharp turn in our story, the gateway to a night of horrors. Chantel, returning home late from work, noticed that Riley's bedroom door was closed. Her instinct was to leave her be. She assumed Riley was either sleeping or immersed in her usual late-night chat with Hayden. Chantel didn't disturb her, not knowing that silence can sometimes hide the most evil of truths. The silence behind that closed door was not a peaceful silence. It was hiding a sinister secret, a brutal reality that would slowly unravel in the agonizing days to follow. What actually occurred between 11:01 p.m. that night and the following morning. We may never know the full, unfiltered truth. It's a black hole in the narrative, a chasm of unanswered questions and horrifying possibilities, a void that will forever haunt the memories of those who loved Riley. The next day, Wednesday, May 8th, Hayden woke up at 5 a.m. and saw he'd missed a FaceTime call from Riley the night before. It was like a sudden jolt of electricity that woke him from his slumber. Alarm bells began to ring in his head, a sense of foreboding seeping into his heart, a gut feeling that something was terribly wrong. Chantel checked on Riley around 7:15 a.m. Riley was nowhere to be found. It was not unheard of for Riley to leave for school early, especially with Hayden's class trip scheduled for that day. She figured she'd gone to the school to see him before his trip, but there was something off. Her gut instinct was telling her something was terribly wrong. She then noticed Riley's purse, glasses, and phone charger were still at home. She never left home without them. Never. This was a red flag, a subtle warning that something was terribly amiss. The day proceeded with a disquieting sense of normalcy. Everyone, seemingly unaware of the horror that had already unfolded, went about their daily routines. They all believed they'd see Riley later that afternoon. However, when she failed to show up after school, her grandmother became worried and contacted Chantel, who immediately tried to contact Riley. All her calls and texts went unanswered. This was very unusual. Riley was like most teenagers, always glued to her phone and always quick to reply. Panic began to set in as Chantel realized she had not actually seen Riley the night before, only assumed she was in her room, hidden behind a closed door. Her mother's intuition screamed that something was terribly wrong, but she didn't know the half of it. Andy, when informed of Riley's disappearance, began acting strangely. Initially, he acted as if he was eager to help search for her, but when Chantel returned, she found him asleep on the couch, the search for Riley seemingly forgotten. Chantel, fueled by intense fear, immediately drove to Berkeley Springs High School, where she learned Riley had never attended school that day. The frantic search for Riley had begun, and the sense of dread was rising like a flood. It was now abundantly clear that Riley had not gone to school, that she was really, truly missing. Chantel made the frantic call, contacting Hayden to see if he'd heard or seen Riley. He told her he hadn't. This moment was a turning point in the narrative. It moved from a mother's unease to the horrible realization that her daughter was missing. Her instincts were screaming that something was terribly, terribly wrong, but her worst fears were yet to be realized. Chantel immediately called 911 to report her daughter missing. Initially, the police might have reacted with caution, dismissing it as a typical runaway case. After all, it's not unheard of for teenagers to leave without informing their parents. But Riley, with her responsible and thoughtful nature, was not the typical runaway. Her father, Lance, and everyone who knew her understood this was out of character for her, that she was too considerate to cause such worry. They also stated she was not old enough to drive and would not leave her family to worry. The only logical explanations were that she'd been involved in an accident, or worse, that she was abducted against her will. This realization was like a cold hand clutching at everyone's hearts. Officers began their investigation, interviewing family members and friends. One of Riley's friends told investigators she might have been afraid of Andy McCauley, which intensified the investigation. Andy's past, full of drug, burglary, and assault charges, made him an instant person of interest. He was like a dark, threatening shadow lurking in the background from the very beginning. Law enforcement brought in a canine unit, hoping to pick up Riley's scent to find some kind of trail. Andy, when questioned by officers, appeared cooperative, describing his interactions with Riley, stating he last saw her at the house the previous night, that she was upstairs before he went to bed. He also stated he got up at 4 a.m. and left for work at 5 a.m. However, the details of his seemingly innocuous statement would soon be picked apart, revealing a web of lies. He stated he worked in construction in Martinsburg. As the search intensified, the Morgan County Sheriff's Office reached out to law enforcement in Maryland and Virginia. Federal agencies, including the FBI, ATF, and Department of Homeland Security, were called in. These agencies provided resources and expertise invaluable in complex missing person cases. It was like a giant net closing in, the law enforcement community coming together to find Riley. But time was running out. When Chantel was shown the text messages Riley had sent Hayden, the shocking realization that Andy might have entered her room to assault her sent shivers down everyone's spines. The suspicion that her own daughter was attacked in her own home was almost too much to bear. He was brought in for questioning multiple times, even shown those text messages. He remained unsettlingly calm. He said there was no reason for her to leave. When asked if she was afraid to come home, he stated, "There was nothing like that." Andy volunteered to take a polygraph test. However, his results were inconclusive, the reason being he was under the influence of drugs at the time. It was like the first sign of his lies starting to unravel. He continued to be questioned by officers and investigators, changing his story, adding layer upon layer of lies. Phone records showed he texted a friend multiple times around 2:30 a.m. on the morning of May 8th, directly contradicting his claim he'd been asleep. He then stated he left his home on foot to buy drugs because he was going into withdrawals. He also stated he got up around 4 a.m. and left for work an hour later. He was working for a construction company at the time, at a job site in the Red Hills subdivision, but his boss painted a different picture. He said Andy had asked for 3 heavy-duty trash bags, claiming he needed to clean up another job site. When Andy returned 4 to 5 hours later, his boss noticed his shoes were untied, his clothes disheveled, giving the impression he'd gotten dressed in a hurry. These details seemed small, but added to the growing suspicion of Andy. The lies were piling up, each lie more damning than the last, and they all pointed to Andy's involvement. Further investigation revealed CCTV footage of Andy's green truck. The footage showed him traveling on multiple roads, and his claims about the roads he'd taken did not match the evidence, including his denials he'd been on Tuscarora Pike. When confronted with the video evidence, Andy was forced to admit he'd lied. He stated he went to buy drugs, not wanting to incriminate himself. Andy was a drug addict, but this excuse did not add up. One coworker said he already had drugs on him that day and wouldn't have had to buy more. Investigators knew Andy had spent 4 to 5 hours doing something other than buying drugs, and it had something to do with Riley's disappearance. Morgan County Sheriff Corporal Luke Shambaugh stated Andy had lied about nearly everything and changed his story multiple times. The officers and investigators were all of the same opinion. They believed he was involved in Riley's disappearance somehow. Now they just needed to find the evidence and hopefully find Riley before it was too late. Later, when Riley's saliva and DNA were found on a pillow in her bedroom, it sent shivers down everyone's spines. They feared she was already dead. As the days dragged on with no sign of Riley, even the most optimistic friends and family members began losing hope. Then, 8 days after she went missing, their worst fears were confirmed. On Saturday, May 16, 2019, a body was discovered in heavy-duty black trash bags. It was located along the embankment of Tuscarora Pike, around 25 miles from her home. The body was badly decomposed, making identification impossible. However, the victim was a young woman or teenage girl. Her t-shirt was bunched up around her neck, and her denim shorts were torn, unbuttoned, and partially unzipped. Her underwear was pulled up unnaturally high. There was also a chalky white substance on the victim's shoes, and screws scattered around the site. They were fairly sure it was Riley, but couldn't bring themselves to tell the parents until a proper identification was made. They did, however, tell Andy McCauley, and wanted to see his reaction. By then, he was already the main suspect. When they informed him of the body discovered on Tuscarora Pike, he was visibly flustered. He asked if they knew who it was. The officers said it had not been identified and they'd not yet notified the parents. Andy replied, "I hope it's not Riley. I loved her like she was my own daughter." His fake concern was like a slap in the face. The following day, the body was sent to the office of the chief medical examiner in Charleston, West Virginia. Dental records confirmed it was indeed Riley Crossman. The advanced decomposition made it impossible for the examiner to determine the exact cause of death, but it was ruled a homicide. Investigators also found the white substance on Riley's shoe was commercial drywall mud, and Andy was unable to explain why drywall screws, like those discovered near her body, were also in his truck and tool belt. The evidence against Andy McCauley was like a mountain, an insurmountable pile of lies and incriminating evidence. Investigators concluded Andy entered Riley's room on May 7th, sneaking up behind her while she was face down on the bed, and strangled or smothered her with a pillow. The motive was believed to be sexual. The medical examiner did not find evidence to support that theory, but Riley's mother had told them he may have entered the room to sexually assault her, and that he could be sexually aggressive when using drugs. Police arrested Andy on May 16, 2019, and charged him with Riley's murder. The trial for Andy began on September 27, 2021. Over 2 years after the horrific murder, the courtroom was packed and emotionally charged. Circuit Court Judge Deborah McLaughlin, Riley's parents, friends, relatives, the press, law enforcement, local, state, and federal agencies, Prosecutor Dan James, the jury, and the defendant, Andy McCauley, and his attorney, Andrew Arnold, were all in attendance. Everyone believed the state had a solid case against Andy, so it shocked everyone when he pleaded not guilty. Prosecutor Dan James began by presenting an overview of the brutal crime from beginning to end. In a particularly poignant moment, he rhetorically asked why Riley's shorts and underwear were ripped, reminding the jury of the heinous nature of the crime and hinting at the possibility of sexual assault. When Riley's mother took the stand, she provided a sober, emotionless account of the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. Then, Dr. Pyotr Kubitschek from the Office of the Medical Examiner testified about Riley's body and the autopsy results. He stated Riley's shorts were unzipped and unbuttoned, and her underwear was partially torn. The medical examiner also stated there was a white, chalk-like substance on her shoes. He testified the cause of death was homicide, though the exact method could not be determined. West Virginia State Police Sergeant Sean Wolf noted Riley's shorts and underwear were hiked up much farther than normal, and that a portion of her genitals was exposed. He said, "The clothing did not look comfortable. It looked as if someone had pulled them up too high." He also said strangulation and suffocation could not be ruled out. This statement was stricken from the record, as he was not qualified to make it, but it left a horrifying image in the jurors' minds. Later, forensic analysis described how the drywall mud and screws found with Riley's body matched those in Andy's truck and tool belt. Another witness, Andy's old boss, Howard Rurick, stated Andy had asked for heavy-duty trash bags on May 8th and left the job site for 4 to 5 hours. His shoes were untied, and his clothes were disheveled when he returned. Throughout the week-long trial, the prosecution presented over 120 pieces of evidence, including footage of Andy traveling along Tuscarora Pike on May 8th, near where Riley's body was found. During closing arguments, Prosecutor James stressed the crime was premeditated. He reminded the jury how long it takes to die from strangulation or suffocation, and that during that time, the killer would have had plenty of opportunity to relent. As the trial drew to a close, jurors were informed they could add mercy to Andy's sentence if he was found guilty of first-degree murder, meaning he'd be eligible for parole in 15 years. If mercy was not added, he'd be sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. Before the jury considered mercy, Riley's father, Lance, took the stand. He explained how impossible it was to explain who Riley was and what she meant to him, and how her life was frozen in time. He said, "Riley only had 15 years. If you're going to grant mercy, where was the mercy in her crime?" Andy's attorneys argued adding mercy was not a guarantee of parole. It would just mean reviewing his case in 15 years. Afterward, the jury took less than 20 minutes to convict Andy McCauley of first-degree murder, death of a child by a custodian by child abuse, concealing a body. They voted unanimously against attaching mercy to his sentence. On November 4th, 2021, Judge McLaughlin gave Andy life in prison with no possibility of parole. Andy remained stoic and refused to make a statement after the sentence was read. At the trial's conclusion, Riley's mother, Chantel, Prosecutor James, and all officers and investigators expressed disappointment that the death penalty was not an option in West Virginia. Andy McCauley is now serving his sentence at the Mount Olive Correctional Complex in south-central West Virginia. This chilling tale leaves us with several questions. How can such evil exist in the human heart? How do we begin to heal from the senseless loss of innocent life? How can we ensure Riley's tragic death will not be in vain? What are your thoughts about this heartbreaking tragedy? Share them in the comments below.